So kind of like we did on the last part of this, I broke it up into a theory part, and then we went into a code along. I'm kind of going to do the same thing today. So I've got some quick theory that I'm going to cover first, and then we'll kind of build something together, adding on to that movie list project. Okay. Your lab today, just to kind of fill you in where we're going with this. So your lab for today and tomorrow is phase 4 of the game library project. There's 3 parts to this. So the first part to this is that I want you to store and track what consoles the games are available on. So is it available on Xbox, PlayStation, Switch, PC, etc. So you'll want to populate that into the database if you haven't yet. We'll kind of talk about how we're going to do that. I'll do that with genres when we talk about the movie list. So I'll kind of talk about how I'm going to do that. So I want you to keep track of what consoles it's available on. As part 1 is put it into the database so you know what consoles are available and display that. The next piece is that I want you to be able to then, given that you have that data in there, be able to filter the list down based on what console. So like, hey, I only want Xbox games. I can pick something from the dropdown, I can pick Xbox from this dropdown, and we'll just show me Xbox games. Or say I just want PC games, filter down to just PC. So that's the second iteration part of this. The third piece of this is to filter it down to not just all games, but filter it down to, hey, I just want the games that are in my library, or I just want the games that are in my wish list, or the combination of those two. So that's that second spinner that we'll have up top. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about from a theory perspective is how do we work with these spinners, because we haven't really used spinners yet. So the new kind of GUI components, so I want to walk through how we're going to utilize this and show you how to use that to filter the response set or the result set. Okay, so that's the main focus of today, is how do we add spinners like this to filter the data down. Okay, so you're going to end up with 2 of these spinners. Okay, so I've got a set of lecture notes that you can find on inside Ranken. They're called Filtering Data with Spinners. So this is what I'll be going through today if you want to follow along. I've got links to relevant reading material where this information comes from, so you can follow that and find out more about some of the things we're going to talk about here. Okay. General objectives for today. This covers both what we're going to do in the reading and also some of the stuff that we're going to do in the practical. Is we're going to look at how do we add spinners to the activity layout. We're going to do that through the designer. How do we populate those with, say, predefined options? We're going to use string array resources, as well as there's a property in the XML called the entries. So we can populate if we know the entries, we know what goes into that dropdown ahead of time, then we can just use that method to do it. Also, from there, we often need to populate it programmatically. So we'll talk about how to do that programmatically. And then going further from that, how do we populate it programmatically when the data is coming from Firestorm, right? So let's say you've got your consoles, right? Your consoles should be a collection within your database. Well, what if we need to use that to populate the dropdown? So that's another thing we'll be looking at. From there, we'll also be looking at how we register on-item listeners, on-item selected listeners, so that we can respond to when the user picks an item from that spinner. And we also want to look at, now that we've got that event, like how do we filter the data? So that's kind of the overview of the main things we want to cover today, is how do we work with those spinners and how do we end up filtering data. Okay, so let's talk about what a spinner is real quickly. So a spinner in the Android world is effectively kind of the equivalent of a combo box or a drop-down widget. So you commonly might hear those kind of terms, combo box or drop-down. Historically, combo box is kind of the word we used in Windows development. If you're building Windows desktop apps, traditionally we called it a combo box, but drop-down is kind of the common term you hear there. So just a few points there. Spinners provide a quick way to select one value from a set. So this only a way to pick one thing, not multiple things. In their default state, they're going to appear collapsed as you're used to with the drop down, and then if you touch them, they expand, as you can see kind of in this round shot, where they drop down and you see multiple options. It's also possible, depending on the configuration, to have these options to pop up in a dialog, and I'll show you how to do that, in addition to just being a drop down. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of what we're working with, is we're trying to build these things out, these drop downs. But we call them spinners in the Android space. I think that name is kind of borrowed from iPhone and their original implementation of these drop downs, where when they came up with these, they actually kind of looked like rolling, spinning, you kind of like a slot machine kind of thing where you roll down. I think that's where the name came from. It's kind of the UI implementation over on iPhone, but it doesn't really look that way anymore, per se. So generally adding it to the layout, it's going to be a spinner tag. You can see I've got an ID on this one, so I said, hey, this is maybe the address type spinner. We've got the width and the height. The height is generally going to be wrap content. The width, well, it depends on where you put it in your layout. But in this case, we're going to have those expend the full width, so they'd be match parent or 0. Okay. In terms of populating it with just the XML, there's a quick process that we can go through if we just want to say, hey, I already know the options ahead of time, just populate it with these things. Okay. So first things first, it's really just 2 steps that you have to do to populate the options. Is I go to strings XML and I add something called a string array. So far, what all we've had in our files has been just strings, right? We've extracted a bunch of strings from our code, both from the XML and from the Java to put here, but now we're adding an array of strings to the XML. So it kind of looks like this. Usually we would have a string tag at the beginning and the end, but you can see it's a string-array tag instead. We have to give it a name, and that's how we're going to refer to it in code or other places. So I'm calling this the address types array. And within there's a bunch of item tags. So that represents the items that are in the array. So this is basically an array of strings with 4 items. Cool. So home, work, other, custom, which is what you see in that screenshot. Okay. So I define that array, and then I can use it directly over where I added the spinner. So I can set the Android entities and just say, hey, well, here, use this array. Notice it's at array, not at string, because it's an array resource rather than a string resource, address types array. So just doing those 2 things is the quickest way you could populate a dropdown, right? That's one that unfortunately isn't in a lot of the documentation. You could find it on Stack Overflow and people talking about it, but it's actually not really discussed in Android's own tutorial about this, which is kind of weird, but it's somewhat newer, so maybe that's why, but this is kind of easy way. So we will be using that for one of these dropdowns, okay? Because for one of these dropdowns, we do know ahead of time what those options are going to be. If I go back and think about what's on the lab assignment, we've got 2 dropdowns here. The first one is to pick which platform, right? Well, that's going to vary. The number of platforms you have is going to vary based on the database, so that's going to be dynamic. Versus the other one, I've said this one should always have the options all games, my library, my wish list, and my library wish list. So those are fixed. We already know those options ahead of time. So for that one, we are gonna just hard code it in, use a string array, set it up with entries, and we're good. Okay. So, and I'm also even going to start the console one that way as well before I make it dynamic, because it's kind of the easiest way to go about it, or the genre one. Okay, so that's one way you can do it. Okay, if you get in a situation where you need to pull it from the database, a file, or some other dynamic source, then we need to do it in code. Okay. Now, to populate it programmatically, we have to use something called a spinner adapter. It's kind of similar to our recycler adapters, right? In fact, our recycler viewers adapters are kind of inherited from this idea. This actually is an older version of it that predates recycler views. So we create a spinner adapter, and there's a bunch of different version implementations of that interface. But the most common one we use is Arrayadapter. Okay. If you go into the documentation for the spinner adapter class itself, or interface itself, you'll find all of the different versions of this that there are. So it says known indirect subclasses. So there's cursor adapters, there's resource cursor adapters, there's simple adapter, simple cursor adapter, and simple adapter, in addition to these other ones. And those are used for other purposes, namely the ones that say cursor. What they mean by that is a cursor in a database, where you're basically getting the result set. Worth noting that cursor really is only a concept that works with SQL databases. So the ones that say cursor adapter only work with ones where you're using specifically the SQL APIs that are built into Java. Okay, if you're using ODBC. Otherwise, you end up kind of having to build your own thing. Okay, so if you're using another database that's not SQL or ODBC, you might use something else. Here in our case, because Firebase gives it to us really as an array, we'll be using the Arrayadapter. And actually, Arrayadapter is a bit of a misnomer because Arrayadapter actually works with both lists and arrays. It actually works with either one. So just a little bit a side note there. Okay, so Arrayadapter can take any sort of array or list and kind of wrap it. It does the same kind of thing where we did with recycler view, where we need to create this adapter that turns a list of items, list of objects, into a list of views. So this spinner adapter is serving that same role. It's turning an array of things into views that appear on screen. Now, the Arrayadapter that's built in is pretty limited in the sense that it really can only represent, it's really only designed to represent a list of, or an array of strings. It says it can do other things, but it's typically just strings. If it's not strings, what it will do is it will just call the toString method on whatever you give it. So if I give it say an array of employees, it will just run toString on all of those employees and use that as the text that it shows. Everybody good with that? So you can technically give it other types, and it is generic because it will take other things. But large in part, we're going to just give it an array or a list of strings. Okay? That's what I'm going to do. So in terms of creating the Arrayadapter, there are a few different constructors if you look in the documentation, but the two that we really care about today is these two here. So you take 3 arguments. The first argument in both of these is the context, which in our case would be the activity, right? So the activity context. The second argument is this resource, okay? That second argument is has to be a layout resource specifically. It has to be a layout for the items in the dropdown, okay? Now, it's possible to implement that yourself. It's possible to make your own layout and design it. There's a lot of gotchas with that, so I would really not recommend providing your own layout unless you're really wanting to get into the weeds and do some theming with it. So I wouldn't recommend building your own layout for that second argument. I would recommend using one that's built in. Namely, the one that's built in that we recommend using is android.r.layout.simple simple spinner item. So that's just going to be the second argument we pass it. That's a layout that's already built into Android. Notice that there's one thing that's different there. Traditionally, when we're referring to resources, we typically say r.layout.rname, right? Notice the Android dot at the beginning of that. The Android dot says it's not part of our project, it's part of Android. So occasionally you'll run into this if you're using built-in resources, whether it be built-in layouts or colors or IDs, etc. If it's built into Android, it will start with Android.r instead of just r. Cool? Okay. So that's what we'll use as the second argument. As the third argument, you can either use an array of objects or you can use a list of objects. In both cases, you'll notice that there's this word, this letter T there. So T brackets array. That's because the class itself is generic. So if I create an array adapter string, then that T becomes string. If that's an array adapter employee, then that T would become employee. So it's basically what type of thing is this array adapter going to contain. Okay? So that's where that fits in. And so it's either a list of that type or an array of that type. So an example of what this might look like in terms of populating a spinner programmatically is I would start by first finding the view. So I'd say find view by ID, go find it by, hey, we want to find the address type field. Okay. Next up, I need to create a list with those entries that I want in there. So I'm just going to simply create a list here. This should actually be array list. So I create an array list of options, and then I add in home or other custom, or however you're going to add those in. In our reality, it will probably come from the database, right? How we'll populate that list, okay? But however you get that list, here I'm just hard coding it, you get that list, and then you're going to pass it into the constructor for the adapter. So I say, let's create a new array adapter. Here I'm creating a new array adapter string, because I have a list of strings, okay? And I'm going to pass in the context, which is do this activity. I pass in that layout, which I said I'm just going to use that. Android.r.layout, that simple spinner item. And I'm going to pass in my options. That list is the third argument, okay? That should look very similar to how we set up a recycler view, right? The gotcha is that I don't have to actually write the adapter. In fact, I don't want to write the adapter. I'm just using this array adapter. Okay. The gotcha is that array adapter can only really represent an array of strings. If we have something other than array of strings that we want to represent, that's when I often will maybe go into maybe making a subclass or making a different version of that in different layouts. Okay. So if it's something you want to represent in the spinner that's not just strings, then you would get into it. An example of what that might mean, maybe in the dropdown you want both the text, the name of the platform, plus an icon for the platform. If that's the case, where you want to represent two different views in there, well, then you would need to customize it. Okay, so that's an example of where that might come up. But this is that simple case, and that will be sufficient for this lab, because I just want you to show a list of strings. Last step. I need to assign the adapter to the spinner. So I say spinner.setAdapter and set it to the adapter. Again, this should look very similar because we've already done the recycle view. So it's the same kind of pattern. The difference is we don't have to set up any sort of layout manager because with the spinner, they're always vertically oriented. There's no sort of grid layout, etc. Okay? Questions? Does that make sense? So again, should be similar to the recycler view. One thing I need to warn you about is that calling setAdapter, this line here at the end, will reset the selected position to 0. So when I call setAdapter, it's going to change from whatever item was selected previously to the first item in the list. Doesn't really say that much in the docs, but it does happen and it can become an issue. So we may need to add some additional code as we're setting the adapter, as we're updating that adapter, to preserve what the user had already selected. So we may need to preserve it before we change the adapter, and then restore it after we replace the adapter. Cool? So that's a thing to keep in mind. We need to make sure we do that when I write the code. Yeah.
I'm confused. What would they have already selected if we're adding the drop-down list settings?
So oftentimes you'll find yourself calling setAdapter later on in the code. So for instance, in our case, remember that we're likely going to be setting up live data and listeners. And so anytime if, let's say on the back end, we have the list of console changes, that's going to fire a snapshot listener, which would then update the list that shows in the spinner. which would then call setAdapter. So it would be if the consoles change on the back end, would trigger a call to setAdapter. The other thing that happens is if the user turns the screen sideways, that's another case that we have to deal with, where we have to restore the value that they had selected. Does that make sense? So there's a few different places where we have to do this and restore that value. Okay, and we'll get into that when I go into the code example. But for the simple case of if you're just doing this in onCreate, yeah, maybe then you don't care about it as much, except for you still care about the screen rotation side. So even in the screen rotation side, you still have to deal with that in onCreate. Okay, so last piece on here, talking about how do we respond to events from when the user picks something from that dropdown. Okay, so the way that we respond to that is using, it's going to receive this onItemSelected event. Okay, so in order to handle that, we've got to create an instance of AdapterView.onItemSelectedListener. Okay, that interface has two methods. Okay, that listener has two methods. So it's got an onItemSelected method, and it has a onNothingSelected method. Okay, so onItemSelected fires anytime that changes. If the user picks another option, it's also worth mentioning. Remember that when I said that when you call setAdapter, it sets it back to 0. That will also trigger this event. So if you programmatically replace the adapter or change which item is selected, this listener fires as well. Okay, that's a gotcha, right? So that means that this event will more than likely happen in the program startup, right? In the onCreate, more than likely, depending on when you register the listener. If you register the listener before the call to setAdapter, you're going to immediately get a call to onItemSelected. Okay? If you do it after setAdapter, you won't get that call potentially. So we're going to get that if the item is selected, and then occasionally you'll get onNothingSelected. Typically, the only cases where you get onNothingSelected is if either if you don't have an adapter in there at all. So if you haven't set up the adapter, then you're likely to get onNothingSelected, or if you set an adapter that basically has an array size of 0. If there's no options for the user to choose from, that's a case where you're going to get onNothingSelected. I do believe it can also occur if the list changes and the item that they had selected disappears, like is no longer in the array. So there are some cases where you can get this second thing where nothing is selected. Again, that's usually in the case where there's no options, where the number of options is 0. I would recommend against ever putting code in here. I'm going to go ahead and say that. I would recommend against ever putting anything in onNothingSelected. My experience with that has been, large in part, anytime I put something in there, I eventually found out that I needed to take it out because it caused problems. Because a lot of times, typically that event's just going to be fired as you're changing the list that's in there. And so it's going to be very transient because you're going to change it, and then it's going to be recall onItemSelected. So again, I've usually found that I just leave this thing empty. Cool. So the only one that we're really concerned about is onItemSelected, is that chop event. I don't really care about doing anything in that second one. So that function receives a few different parameters. Okay, so first you've got the adapter view. Adapter view is actually a parent class of Spinner. Spinner is one of the adapter view subclasses. The other instance of adapter view is something called a list view. Both list view and spinners are considered adapter views. Basically, the idea is anything that needs to represent a series of things, and you're going to use an adapter to turn those from objects to things. List view has gone away. We've completely replaced that with recycler view, which is why we haven't talked about that. So this is kind of a relic of times past. It's a little bit different because we're using recycler view over list view. Okay. So in there, that adapter view that you're getting as the first argument is actually the spinner. It's the spinner that triggered the event. Okay. The reason that it's an adapter view and not a spinner is because, again, there's multiple subclasses of adapter view. So we get the parent, we get the spinner. The next argument, called view, is the view that the user clicked on. So let's say I clicked on the third option. It would be that third item. Now, weird thing enough, it's not actually going to be the text view that the user interacted with. It actually would be the layout for that third item. Does that make sense for everybody? So when we're looking at the options that are in the dropdown, inside the dropdown, let's say we've got 3 things. 1, 2, 3. So within here, there is a layout, and then there's also a text view, which is where the text is being displayed. But that view that you get will actually be the layout of the item, not the text view of the item. Okay. There's also a layout for the item when it's collapsed. So you'll see that sometimes in the code example where people are setting those 2 different layouts. Okay. The third argument you get in there is the position. So that'll be the position where it is in the list or the array or the adapter view. You can think about the array adapter. You can think of it either way. But that's the main one we're interested in. That is the main one that we're going to key into of like, okay, which item did the user select? We'll look at the position. The fourth argument there is what's called the row ID in the documentation of the selected item. Suffice it to say, it's not the thing you want. You want the position and not the row ID. Those don't have any correlation. So the row ID is really more of an internal thing. For all intents and purposes, forget that it's there because you won't want to use it. Okay? So you definitely want to prefer to use the position over the row ID. You'll notice there's some kind of weirdness going on there where the position is an integer and the long is an ID. Again, relic of what it's doing. Okay? So just a word of caution there. That's what I wanted to mark. One thing to note here that unfortunately, because this listener, because this interface actually has 2 methods, the shorthand that we've usually done in terms of using lambda functions or arrow functions doesn't work. Because remember, to use an arrow function, it has to be an interface with 1 method. So this, because this listener is 2, I can't use arrow functions, sad face. I have to use an anonymous class. Okay, and so that's where you're going to see all this extra stuff around it. We're going to say new adapter view on item selected listener. I have to define the names of the functions and their parameters, and then return void, public, all of that. So all that extra noise, unfortunately, does have to be there. I really wish that they'd broken this up into 2 different interfaces, but they didn't. And this is kind of old at this point, so I don't know. I think that I would say as far as Google is concerned, spinners have really fallen on the back burner in the wake of recycler view, but they're still kind of an important component. So hopefully we'll see them make some updates in the next few years, but they've kind of fallen away. So let's look at how we actually set this up. So in terms of, let's say I want to respond to when the user picks that address type dropdown. Just like before, I need to make sure I find the view. I could, in between there, if I populated it through the XML, I don't need to do anything more with the Arrayadapter, etc. But if I'm doing it programmatically, that would happen between those 2 things. So if I needed to populate the list, populate the Arrayadapter, I would probably do that here. Then I'm going to register the listener. So I'm going to say spinner.onItem selected listener. You can see that the parentheses open here on this line. That's the beginning of the function call, and then the end of the function call is all the way here at the end. So between that, I'm actually creating a anonymous class, okay, which is what we saw in the previous bit. That whole part in between is me defining the listener. Okay, so I'm defining that listener. I'm saying new adapter view listener. Remember that this is an interface, so technically, as you know, you typically can't construct abstract classes or interfaces, right? But here I'm constructing it and defining it at the same time, so that's why it works. Is I'm defining both of those abstract methods as I'm creating the object. Okay, so I'm going to say here, on item selected, here's our behavior. Let's just say, hey, let's just show a toast message with the item that the user selected. So we can get the particular item that the user selected using get item at position. So we can call that on the spinner, or it's actually inherited from adapter view. So I don't have to cast that down to the spinner. So I just say parent.get item at position. That will get me the object that the user selected. Okay, and I say here's the position. I'm casting it to a string because that function returns an object. Okay, that function returns an object, it doesn't return the type you put in. So I'm casting it to a string because I know previously I populated this with strings. If I had populated this with, say, employees or games, I would need to cast it to an employee or a game, right? Whatever object I populated the list with, and cast that down. Okay, so cast it to a string option, message I'm going to use is selected with the option, and then we'll just show a toast like that. So if the user clicks on the item, they'll see a toast with the option that they get. That's a kind of a quick way to kind of see how we're going to use this, how to respond to those events. We'll add some more to that because we want to use that to filter the data down. Okay, but you can kind of see the interface. Cool. Questions? So that's kind of the 10,000 view, 10,000 foot view of what we're going to be working with, how you work with the spinner, how you populate it with data, and how you are going to respond to events on it. So the next thing we want to do is enhance our movie list project with the stuff that we just covered here. Okay? So I'm going to pause.